My name is Robert Hastings. I am 70 years old, and I live in the Belmead neighborhood of Nashville, Tennessee. I am also still, somehow, learning how to breathe after surviving the deepest betrayal a father can know. For 50 years I built a commercial heating and cooling company out of nothing, out of a rusted van, a set of borrowed tools, and a wife who believed in me when no bank would. I built it so that my family would never taste the poverty I grew up in. And then, last month, at a candlelit dinner meant to honor my late wife, my own son slammed his Scotch glass onto the table, pointed a trembling finger into my face, and hissed 4 words at me. "Stop wasting my money." I did not scream. I did not argue. I simply looked at him in total silence. And the very next morning, I emptied every account he believed he controlled, exposed everything he had hidden, and walked away from him completely. Before I take you into that dinner, and everything that came after it, do me one small favor. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And if you have ever had to stand up to family who mistook your kindness for weakness, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is for you. It was a bitter, wind-cut Tuesday evening in late November, the kind of Tennessee cold that slips past your overcoat and settles into your bones, much like the grief I had carried every single day for 3 years. We were seated in a dim, expensive steakhouse in downtown Nashville. I was paying, of course. I always paid, but the dinner was meant to be sacred. We had gathered to mark the 3rd anniversary of the death of my wife, Eleanor. Eleanor had been my whole foundation. She was the woman who stood beside me when I was a 20-something kid dragging industrial air conditioning units out of the back of a battered Ford. In those years, I split my knuckles open every morning and worked 90-hour weeks just to keep the lights on. She was the quiet strength behind Hastings' industrial climate systems, and through decades of grinding sacrifice, the two of us grew that tiny operation into a $40 million enterprise. Now at that polished table it was only 3 of us, me, my 35-year-old son Nathan, and his wife Vanessa. Nathan had taken over as chief executive officer exactly 1 year earlier. I had stepped back to the role of chairman, convinced it was finally time to let the next generation lead. Vanessa, a former real estate agent with an expensive appetite for designer labels and private clubs, sat beside him, sipping imported wine and looking bored, entirely detached from the meaning of the evening. The restaurant itself was serene. Soft jazz drifted through the room, crystal clinked in gentle toasts, waiters moved like shadows. But our table felt like a held breath. There had been a poison in the air for months, and I had been choosing not to smell it. Nathan had grown distant, arrogant, sharp-edged. I made excuses for him. I told myself he was simply crushed under the pressure of running the company. I was wrong. When the waiter cleared our plates and poured the last of the wine, I decided it was the moment to share something that had been giving me a rare kind of peace. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and drew out my leather checkbook, setting it gently on the white tablecloth. I looked at Nathan, searching his face for some trace of his mother. "I've been thinking about your mom all week," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "You know how much she loved Grace Fellowship Church. That old sanctuary has had a collapsing roof for years now. Eleanor always talked about fixing it for them. So, to honor her tonight, I'm going to write a check for $50,000 from my personal savings to restore that roof." I expected a nod, perhaps a shared moment of grief, a quiet acknowledgement of the woman who gave him life. Instead, what I got was instant, violent, and unforgettable. Nathan snatched his heavy crystal glass and drove it down against the table with such raw force that the stem shattered in his hand. The crack of breaking glass ripped through the elegant room. Diners at nearby tables stopped mid-sentence and turned. Amber liquor and jagged shards spread across the white linen like a dark stain. He leaned across the table into my space, his face flushed a furious red, the veins standing out along his neck, and he jabbed his finger straight at me. "Stop wasting my money," he said, low and venomous, the words carrying clean over the jazz. "What the hell are you doing, writing 50 grand checks to some useless church? Are you losing your mind?" Under the table I heard a sharp thud, Vanessa kicking his shin, her eyes darting nervously toward the wealthy strangers now watching us. Nathan flinched, but his glare never left my face. His chest heaved beneath the custom Italian jacket that the empire I built had paid for. I did not flinch, I did not raise my hands, I did not yell. I simply went still, staring into the eyes of a stranger wearing my son's face. My money, he had just called my personal savings, Money I had bled and frozen and sacrificed 4 decades of my life to earn. His money. I had breathed toxic fiberglass on rooftops in January. I had given up my youth so this boy would never know hunger. I stepped back from the daily grind for a single year, and in that 1 year his entitlement had grown into something monstrous. He truly believed he owned my wealth. He believed he owned me. The whole restaurant seemed to wait for the old man to explode, to make a scene, to put his disrespectful son in his place. But I am not a man who fights in public. I am a man who observes, calculates, and executes. I reached out slowly, picked up my checkbook, and slid it back into my pocket. Said nothing. I stood, my back straight, pulled $200 bills from my wallet, and laid them on the ruined tablecloth to cover the meal. Then I turned away from my son and his wife, and walked out through the heavy doors into the freezing Nashville night. The wind hit my face, but I barely felt it. My mind had never been clearer. My heart, broken as it was beating with a cold new purpose. I knew, without a shred of doubt, that a war for my own life had just begun, and I would not be its victim. I would be the architect of its ending. I woke before dawn the next morning. 40 years of rising at 4:30 to load trucks had hardwired my body. The house was painfully quiet, a sprawling brick estate in Belle Meade that Eleanor and I had bought 2 decades earlier. Without her, it felt like an empty museum. I brewed a pot of black coffee and sat at the kitchen island, watching frost cling to the bare oak branches in the yard, replaying Nathan shattering that glass, the rage, the entitlement. The coffee tasted like ash. At 8, the brass knocker on my front door echoed through the silent hall. I set down my mug, crossed the foyer, and opened it. Nathan and Vanessa stood on my porch. The wind whipped Vanessa's styled blonde hair across her face. Nathan clutched an enormous shrink-wrap froth basket, complete with a ridiculous gold ribbon. He looked terrible, bloodshot eyes, the pale, clammy sheen of a hangover. Vanessa, by contrast, was flawless in a cashmere coat, wearing a bright, forced smile that never reached her eyes. "Dad," Nathan said, his voice raspy and small, nothing like the roar from the steakhouse. "Can we come in? We need to talk." Every instinct I had, the same instincts that had carried my company through 3 recessions, told me to shut the door in their faces. But a good businessman never closes a door until he knows what the person on the other side is selling. So I stepped back and let them in. Nathan pushed the fruit basket into my hands. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the granite without touching the ribbon. Then I led them to the sitting room Eleanor had decorated with such care, and took my armchair by the fireplace. They perched together on the edge of the leather sofa like guilty schoolboys. I did not offer them coffee or water. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. In a negotiation, the first person to break the silence is usually the one who loses. I have the patience of stone. Nathan cracked first. He buried his face in his hands for a theatrical second. "Dad, I'm so sorry about last night," he began, his voice thick with manufactured remorse. "My behavior was unacceptable. I was out of line, especially on Mom's anniversary. The stress is eating me alive. We're expanding into Memphis and Knoxville. At the same time, the supply chain is a nightmare. I haven't slept in weeks. I had too much scotch on an empty stomach, and when you pulled out that checkbook, I panicked. That's not who I am. I didn't mean it." He blamed the alcohol. He blamed the supply chain. He blamed the very company I had handed him on a silver platter. He took no real accountability for a single word. Before I could respond, Vanessa leaned in and laid a manicured hand on his knee, fixing me with an expression of sickly sweet concern. "It's the truth, Robert," she said, her voice pure velvet. "Nathan has been working himself to the bone to make you proud. But honestly, we've both been so worried about you. You've been living alone in this huge house for 3 years. Grief does strange things to the mind." My heart slowed to a cold, steady rhythm. "Worried about me," I said flatly. "Yes," she went on without missing a beat. "You're so generous, Robert, sometimes too generous. We keep reading these awful stories about elder fraud, scammers who prey on wealthy older men living alone, who manipulate grief to pull huge donations out of them. When you took out that checkbook last night, Nathan just panicked, because he wants to protect you. He meant to say our family's money, not his money. He was terrified you were being taken advantage of." She tilted her head, a look of practiced maternal warmth. "That's why we quietly set up a family protection trust last week, just to shield your personal assets from scammers. It's a very standard safeguard for older, high-net-worth individuals. It was a brilliant lie." She was reframing my act of charity as a symptom of senility, and Nathan's violent outburst as an act of protective love. I nodded slowly, softening my face, pretending to accept it. But deep in my chest, 40 years of instinct were screaming. The phrase family protection trust sounded less like a shield and more like a cage, a permanent, unbreakable one. After they left with their hollow apologies and their fruit basket, the silence of the estate felt heavier than before. I needed air. I needed something real. So I went to the detached garage and pulled the canvas cover off my 1978 Ford pickup. Forest green, the first vehicle I ever bought new with cash from the business. No touchscreens, no trackers, just honest steel and combustion. Driving it always reminded me of who I was before the millions, before the boardrooms, before greed infected my family. I had a simple winter tune-up scheduled at a small independent shop across town, run by a man named Walt, a man who worked with his hands and understood the value of labor. The drive was cold and grounding. We spent an hour talking engines and football while he swapped my spark plugs and oil. When he finished, the bill came to $415, a trivial sum for a man in my position. I handed him my private wealth card, a heavy black metal thing tied to a reservoir of liquid cash I had spent decades building. He swiped it. The terminal gave a harsh negative beep. He frowned, wiped the strip, swiped again. Same beep? Robert, he said quietly, embarrassed, I'm real sorry. It says declined. Declined. The word landed like a physical blow. I had millions in that account, kept strictly separate from the company. I had never, not once in my adult life, had a card declined. I forced a calm smile, told Walt it must be a security flag, and stepped outside to call my private banker, a senior executive named Gregory Simmons who handled my portfolio personally. Gregory always answered on the first ring, eager and warm. This time the phone rang 5, 6, 7 times. Then a click and a voice that was not warm at all. Hesitant, terrified. Hello, Robert. Gregory, I said, measured but firm. I'm standing in the cold at a mechanic's shop and my card was just declined on a $400 charge. I need you to lift whatever hold is on my funds right now. The silence on the line was absolute. I could hear him swallow. Robert, I'm so sorry, he finally whispered. I can't lift the hold. I no longer have the legal authority to give you access to those funds. The cold I felt inside was far worse than the wind. What are you talking about? It's my account. It's my money. Robert, please listen carefully. First thing this morning, your son Nathan walked into my office with 3 corporate attorneys. They presented a binding court order, signed by a probate judge. Your accounts haven't been flagged for fraud. They've been frozen under an emergency co-conservatorship. Nathan has been granted temporary control over all your personal finances. A conservatorship. I am a healthy, capable man. My mind is sharp, but my blood ran cold as the truth slammed home. The Family Protection Trust was never meant to shield me from strangers. It was a weapon built to strip me of my independence. They had not protected my money. They had legally locked me out of my own life. The war had begun in earnest. I did not curse the sky. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared. I climbed back into the truck and drove straight to the downtown headquarters of Hastings Industrial Climate Systems, a glass and steel tower I had laid the foundation for 20 years earlier. I knew every beam and every hidden access panel in that building. But as it rose against the gray sky, it no longer looked like my life's achievement. It looked like a fortress held by an enemy. I parked away from my reserved spot and slipped in through the lobby, unnoticed. Just a 70-year-old man crossing the marble. I bypassed reception and rode the executive elevator up. When the doors opened onto the top floor, I did not march to the corner office. I stayed in the shadow of the hallway, and I watched. Through the glass wall of what had been my office, I saw Vanessa. She was seated at the mahogany desk, dripping in jewelry, a heavy gold pen in her hand, casually signing real estate transfer deeds printed on the company's own letterhead. She was liquidating Hastings' property, converting warehouses and distribution centers into cash, without a single board vote, almost certainly funneling the money into offshore accounts. My chest burned, but my mind stayed cold. Confrontation without leverage is just noise, and I needed leverage. I memorized the scene, turned, and walked silently back down the hall. I could not trust the corporate lawyers. Their checks were signed by Nathan now. I needed someone whose loyalty was mine alone, someone who understood the brutal reality of corporate warfare. So I drove 20 miles out of the city to a neon-lit diner on a lonely stretch of highway, The kind of place where tired truckers drink burnt coffee and nobody asks questions. In the back booth sat Frank Delaney, my former attack dog attorney, the man who had defended my company against hostile takeovers for 30 years before retiring to bourbon and fishing. Brilliant legal mind, and no moral hesitation when it came to protecting his clients. I slid into the cracked vinyl across from him. "You look like a man who just watched his own funeral," Frank said. I laid it all out with surgical precision. The dinner, the shattered glass, the theatrical apology, the trust, the declined card, the conservatorship, Vanessa signing away my warehouses. Frank set his mug down. He didn't look shocked. He looked analytical. "A conservatorship, that's the nuclear option, Robert. They didn't just freeze your checking. They convinced a judge you're mentally incapacitated, that you're no longer a functioning adult. That takes documentation. They'd need a licensed physician to sign a sworn affidavit confirming severe cognitive decline. They've been planning this for months. I need to know exactly how deep the knife goes," I said. "Right now." Frank pulled a battered laptop from his briefcase, connected to a secure hotspot, and dug straight into county records and state judicial databases. His jaw tightened. "The Family Protection Trust is real," he said, "but it's not a shield, it's a vacuum. They structured it as an ironclad, irrevocable trust, with Nathan as controlling trustee and Vanessa as secondary. They've already funneled the bulk of your liquid assets into it. The fraudulent conservatorship gave them the authority to move your money without a single signature from you. You are legally locked out of your own savings." He paused, fingers flying. "But those property transfers you saw, that's what worries me most. They're liquidating your prime commercial real estate for untraceable cash." Then he opened a new tab, pulled up county deed records, and typed in the address of my Belle Meade estate, the home where Eleanor and I had raised our family, the home I had paid off 2 decades ago. The loading icon spun. When the page filled with government text, Frank stopped. He drew a slow breath and looked up at me, grimmer than I had ever seen him in 30 years. "Robert, brace yourself." He turned the laptop toward me. There, in black and white, was the deed to my home. My name was gone. In its place, listed as sole owners, were Nathan and Vanessa Hastings. The transfer had been executed 3 weeks earlier. My signature had been flawlessly forged. I did not just lose my company or my accounts, I had lost my sanctuary. If I drove home right now and confronted them, they would not simply ignore me. They could legally evict me on the spot, call the police, and have me arrested for trespassing in my own home. I walked out of that diner with Frank's warning in my ears, feeling nothing but the cold. My own son had forged my signature and stolen the house where his mother once rocked him to sleep. I checked into a modest motel on the county line, paid cash, and sat on the lumpy mattress, staring at the wall. Panic is the enemy of logic. To dismantle Nathan's illusion of control, I needed undeniable proof of his corporate theft. And Nathan, arrogant as he was, had made a fatal mistake. He looked at me like an obsolete dinosaur. He believed that because I didn't understand cloud computing, I was blind to the machinery of my own company. He had deactivated my key card and revoked my passwords, and he thought that locked me out. But he had forgotten the history of the building. 20 years ago, I personally oversaw the installation of the original server architecture. Before cloud storage was the standard, we ran a fortified physical mainframe in the concrete basement. When we modernized, I ordered that core mainframe kept tethered to the network as a failsafe, with a hardwired master override, an off-grid terminal that bypassed every firewall. It wasn't tied to a password. It was tied to my body, my fingerprints, my retina. I reached out to Sal Reyes, a resourceful private investigator I'd kept on retainer for years. I met him at midnight in a deserted grocery parking lot, handed him an envelope of cash, and told him I needed a military-grade encrypted hard drive with the fastest transfer speed he could find. He handed over a heavy black casing and drove off without a single question. I waited until 2 in the morning, until the cleaning crews were gone. Then I drove back to the glass fortress I had built and parked 2 blocks away in a dark alley. Nathan had spent hundreds of thousands upgrading the perimeter. High-definition cameras, motion sensors at every entrance. But he didn't know about the old maintenance tunnel. When the building was first constructed, I had insisted on a service corridor connecting the electrical grid to the municipal storm drains. Its entrance was hidden behind a rusted dumpster, out of sight of his cameras. I pried up the old iron grate with a crowbar and slid down into the damp dark, navigating the narrow passage by a small tactical flashlight until I reached a reinforced steel door. The true back door, built for a brass skeleton key, not an electronic keypad. I had carried that key for 20 years. The tumblers clicked. I stepped into the basement of my own headquarters, the air cold and filtered, the cooling fans humming. I made my way to the central server room, a concrete bunker behind a heavy door with an older access panel Nathan had never touched. I placed my right hand on the scanner. A thin red line swept my palm, then a lens extended, and I aligned my eye with the reticle. For 3 long seconds, the terminal was silent, my heart hammering. If the engineers had ever dismantled this, silent alarms would already be summoning the police. Then the deadbolts retracted with a satisfying clack, and a green light bloomed. I stepped into the freezing server room, rows of black racks blinking like sentinels. I found the master override port, plugged in Sal's encrypted drive, and the system recognized my biometric authority instantly. I was in. I typed a rapid sequence of legacy commands, bypassing Nathan's modern accounting software and diving into the raw root directories. To pass the time while the drive worked, I opened the master ledger for the 3rd quarter. At a glance, everything looked clean, payroll accurate, supplier invoices matching projections, overhead in line with history. Nathan had hired someone skilled to paint a beautiful, fraudulent picture. But I did not build a $40 million company by looking at surfaces. I knew this company's rhythm better than my own heartbeat. I isolated the outgoing vendor payments and filtered by date, starting from the month Nathan became CEO. The truth surfaced immediately. Buried beneath legitimate purchases of copper piping and refrigerant, there was a steady rhythmic bleed, a recurring weekly wire to an entity called Vertex Freight Partners, coded as expedited supply chain fees, billed at $45,000 a week. I cross-referenced our vendor database. Vertex hadn't existed before last November. I ran it through the state corporate registry. It was registered to a P.O. box in Delaware managed by a proxy firm, a textbook shell company. My son was bleeding the company dry. I kept digging, and Vertex was only the start. I uncovered 5 more ghost entities: Meridian Strategic Group, Crestline Purchasing, Ridgemont Consulting, and 2 others. Everyone a fabricated shell siphoning hundreds of thousands under the guise of vague consulting fees. Over 12 months, Nathan had embezzled nearly $4 million. But then a worse inconsistency caught my eye. $4 million was a hemorrhage, yes, but the company generated $40 million a year. That deficit would hurt our margins. It would not bankrupt us. Yet the internal cash flow indicators were flashing red. The company was drowning in a liquidity crisis. I dug into the collateral registries, and what I found made the embezzlement look like a rounding error. Nathan was not merely stealing cash. In a buried directory labeled Offshore Liabilities, I found that he had taken the physical assets of the company, the warehouses, the fleet of 300 service trucks, the heavy machinery, and legally pledged them against massive, highly leveraged offshore margin accounts. He was borrowing tens of millions from unregulated international lenders, using the lifeblood of my company as collateral, and pouring it into volatile markets. He had strapped a financial bomb to the core of the company, and the timer was running. If those margin calls failed, the lenders would seize every asset tied to the Hastings name. They would take the trucks. They would take the tools out of my employees' hands. He had looked me in the eye at that steakhouse, screaming about me wasting his money, while projecting his own catastrophic ruin onto me. He needed the Family Protection Trust to absorb my personal wealth, because he had already destroyed the corporate wealth. The progress bar hit 100%. I ejected the drive and slipped it deep into my coat. I wiped my digital footprint from the override registry so his technology team would never know I'd been there, sealed the port, and stepped back into the freezing corridor. I had the proof. I could hand this drive to federal authorities in the morning and watch my son let out in handcuffs. But the raw data alone wasn't enough. The ledgers proved the mechanics of the theft, but not the tactical plan. Nathan and Vanessa had orchestrated a fraudulent conservatorship and stolen my home. They clearly had a coordinated plan to remove me from the equation permanently, and I needed to know their exact timeline before they blindsided me again. I needed ears inside the executive suite. I needed to hear every word they spoke in the privacy of that corner office. So before I left, I did one more thing. Using the same skills that had built this building's nervous system, I placed a small, encrypted listening device inside the office and paired it to a receiver I could monitor from my truck. Then I climbed back into the cab, drove to a spot where I could sit unseen, fitted the earpiece, and I listened. For 2 days I listened. And on the second night, in a coffee shop parking lot, with the winter wind battering the frozen panels of my truck, I heard the whole plan laid bare. I heard Vanessa complain about the $50,000 in cash they had paid a corrupt psychiatrist. I heard Nathan confirm, with pride, the false stage 2 Alzheimer's diagnosis they had submitted to the probate court in my name. I heard my own son calmly describe how, on Friday morning at exactly 9, a private ambulance crew would arrive at my front door with a psychiatric warrant and a sedative, drag me from the house, and lock me permanently inside the dementia ward at Willow Creek Behavioral Health Center. I heard them calculate the exact hour, Thursday at midnight. They would wire $12 million to the Cayman Islands and vanish. They were going to weaponize the reality of cognitive decline to execute a flawless financial murder, to chemically silence my mind and bury my voice under layers of state bureaucracy. And I understood, sitting there, that if I fought back during the extraction, if I yelled, if I demanded a lawyer, it would only validate the fraudulent narrative. The transport team would read my righteous anger as dementia-induced aggression, strap me to a gurney, and sedate me before I ever saw daylight. I pulled the earpiece from my ear. The static gave way to howling wind. Their timeline was set. Thursday at midnight, the money would fly to the Caymans. Friday at 9, the ambulance would come for my mind. Monday, the corporate bankruptcy would detonate. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They believed I was asleep in my stolen house, blissfully unaware of the guillotine swinging toward my neck. They did not know the encrypted hard drive was in my coat. They did not know I had recorded every damning syllable. I turned the key and the engine roared. The time for silent observation was over. I did not go back to the motel. I drove through the storm to Frank Delaney's home in Franklin, and at 4 a.m. I pounded on his oak door until the porch light flickered on. One look at my face, and Frank asked no questions. He simply ushered me into his study. I set the hard drive on his desk, placed the audio receiver beside it, and hit playback. Frank stood with his arms crossed as the recording filled the room. The corrupt psychiatrist, the $50,000 bribe, the Alzheimer's diagnosis, the ambulance, the Caymans. When it clicked off, he plugged the drive into his forensic computer and worked in silence for nearly an hour, tracing the offshore accounts and the 6 shell companies. Then he stopped, pulled off his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. "Robert, it's worse than embezzlement. Nathan hasn't just been siphoning cash to fund a lifestyle. He's been liquidating your whole infrastructure to cover catastrophic investment losses." He turned the monitor toward me. Nathan had linked the offshore margin accounts to an unregulated black market cryptocurrency exchange in Eastern Europe. He had used the pristine credit of Hastings Industrial to borrow tens of millions from shadow lenders and poured every cent into speculative crypto. Over 8 months, he had lost $20 million. The margin calls were coming due. The lenders were demanding their money. He had drained the corporate reserves and leveraged every truck and warehouse to the legal limit. "That $12 million they're wiring Thursday night," Frank said, "isn't a strategic maneuver. It's the last liquid cash your company has. It's their getaway fund. They're draining the final drops of blood from the empire before the margin debt triggers a default." My son was not a criminal mastermind. He was a terrified gambler who had decimated a $40 million company to hide his own incompetence, because he was too arrogant to admit he was losing. But the financial ruin was only part of the horror. Frank stood and paced. "Robert, you need to understand the federal landscape. The FBI and the SEC are actively investigating these exact offshore crypto platforms for institutional money laundering and wire fraud. Federal task forces are tracing the transaction routes Nathan's been using. It's only a matter of time before they trace those margin accounts straight back to the servers at Hastings Industrial. And then the full malice of the Friday timeline crystallized. Nathan wasn't just stealing my last $12 million. He was framing me for one of the largest corporate wire fraud cases in the state's history. "Do you see the whole board now?" Frank said quietly. "Thursday night, they wire the money and vanish. Friday morning, you're sedated and locked in the dementia ward at Willow Creek. Monday, the bankruptcy triggers the default. When the federal agents raid the headquarters, Nathan and Vanessa are long gone. Your forged signature is on every illegal offshore transfer. You're the sole owner on paper, legally incapacitated, locked in a state asylum, left behind to take the entire fall for federal wire fraud. They were not just stealing my money anymore. They were burying me alive in a concrete cage. We need to contact the FBI immediately, Frank said. We present this drive before Nathan makes the transfer. We secure a federal injunction and freeze every account. I shook my head, a cold focus overriding the panic. We can't go to the federal government yet, Frank. If they freeze the corporate assets now, that $12 million sits in judicial limbo for a decade as evidence. The company defaults on payroll. Every one of my employees loses their job, their health insurance, their livelihood by Friday afternoon. I will not let my workforce suffer from my son's greed. I have to secure that money before the authorities even know it exists. Robert, Frank countered, Nathan holds the legal authority of CEO. He's fortified it with a conservatorship declaring you incompetent. You don't have the authority to move a penny of that money. Any attempt to intercept the wire will trip banking alarms, and the fraud department will defer to the legally recognized chief executive. He holds all the administrative keys. I leaned forward. He holds the administrative keys, but he does not hold the foundational keys. He believes corporate power comes from his executive title. He's forgotten who wrote the original bylaws 28 years ago. Pull up the founding charter. Section 7, paragraph 4. Frank frowned, but he opened the archived charter and scrolled. His scrolling stopped. A sharp breath escaped him. He took off his glasses and stared at the screen. The poison pill, he whispered. When I founded the company, I was a cautious man who mistrusted the corporate world, and I had instructed Frank to weave an obscure clause into its very DNA, an ultimate failsafe. The clause stated that if a sitting CEO was found to be defrauding the corporation, the founder retained the unilateral right to revoke all executive powers and seize control of every liquid asset, with no board vote required. It bypassed every governance protocol, a legal guillotine designed to sever a rogue executive's head. But Robert, Frank said, this clause requires undeniable proof of fraud to trigger. You can't activate it on suspicion. If you trigger it without absolute proof, the banks will penalize the corporation and freeze the transfer. I tapped the hard drive. I have the entire shadow ledger, $4 million in embezzlement. I have the offshore margin documentation proving he collateralized the company's infrastructure without board approval. I have a crystal clear recording of him, admitting he bought a fraudulent medical diagnosis to strip away my rights. I don't just have proof, Frank. I have an avalanche. Draft the declaration of executive revocation. Format the execution of the poison pill. For 48 hours, Frank and I worked in secrecy in his study, cross-referencing every fraudulent transaction against the parameters of the clause, compiling an encrypted packet of undeniable evidence, mapping the routing numbers for a secure holding account Nathan knew nothing about. I barely slept. I survived on black coffee and the raw adrenaline of a father fighting for his life. Thursday night came. The digital clock in the corner of my laptop read 11:55. 5 minutes until Nathan would initiate the offshore transfer. Frank stood behind my chair, his breathing shallow. The execution protocols were loaded. The evidence packets were primed. At 11:56, I pressed the command key, breathing life into the decryption software we had built. The poison pill did not knock politely on Nathan's expensive new firewalls. It bypassed the entire modern network and used the original hardwired root codes I had physically embedded in the foundational servers 20 years ago. The master override sliced through his security tokens like a scalpel through paper. A green prompt blinked, requesting the biometric authorization. I plugged a portable fingerprint scanner into the laptop and pressed my thumb to the glass. A chime. The terminal bypassed the final gateway. I was inside the international wire system of the Hastings financial network, with unilateral control over every liquid asset. No board approval. No secondary signatures. The poison pill had made me a corporate dictator, overriding the fraudulent authority of my own son. I filtered the outgoing wire transfers. A single red-lined item populated the center of my screen. $12,400,000, sitting in a temporary holding account, queued to transfer automatically at 8 o'clock Friday morning to a private bank in the Cayman Islands. It was the last liquid lifeblood of the company, money I had earned across 3 decades of grueling labor. I moved my cursor over the pending transfer. I felt no paternal hesitation. I clicked the cancel prompt. A warning box demanded administrative confirmation. I typed my founder identification code and struck enter. The red line evaporated from the queue. The 12.4 million was ripped from Nathan's grasp and locked back inside the foundational corporate vault. His getaway vehicle was gone. But stopping the theft was not enough. I redirected the entire remaining corporate treasury, every asset the poison pill had unlocked, into a new irrevocable trust, managed by an independent third-party law firm, its funds permanently reserved for legitimate philanthropy and for any future innocent descendants. Nathan could never touch a single dime of it. Then I navigated to Nathan and Vanessa's joint personal account, the one holding the $800,000 I could trace, dollar for dollar, back to the embezzled corporate funds, which placed it squarely within the reach of the fraud recovery clause. I moved it back to the company where it belonged. I hit refresh. The balance read 0. A profound silence filled the room. They were ruined. They had dug a perfectly calculated grave meant for me, and with a few clicks I had guided them into it instead. But erasing their stolen wealth was not enough to balance the scales. They had weaponized the medical establishment and the courts to strip away my humanity, to bury me alive so they could steal my life's work. A simple financial ruin was too merciful for that. I opened a secure directory on my desktop, the arsenal of their downfall, and compiled a federal dossier. First, the fraudulent Alzheimer's diagnosis, with its falsified test results, and the accounting trail tracing the $50,000 bribe from their personal account to the corrupt psychiatrist's offshore shell. Second, the time-stamped audio recording of their entire conspiracy. Third, the offshore ledgers Frank had decrypted, the shell companies, the $20 million in crypto losses, the margin calls, and the final failed $12 million wire. Frank raised one last concern, and it was the concern that vindicated my whole strategy. The margin debt, Robert. Tens of millions owed to those offshore lenders. When it comes due, they'll come for the company's assets regardless. No, I told him. They won't. Nathan pledged those assets without board approval, using authority he obtained through a conservatorship we can now prove was fraudulent. Every one of those collateral agreements was executed under fraudulent pretense by an officer acting outside his lawful power. They're voidable, and once the federal filing establishes the fraud, no legitimate court will enforce a lien built on it. The lenders were dealing in stolen authority. That debt dies with the fraud that created it. The company survives. That was the amputation. I was not destroying the empire out of malice. I was performing a necessary surgery to preserve its final heartbeat and the jobs of the men and women who depended on it. I merged the evidence into a single devastating packet, routed my connection through dozens of international proxy servers for anonymity, and accessed a secure whistleblower email client. In the primary field, I entered the FBI's white-collar crime division. In the secondary, the criminal investigation unit of the IRS, who would relish the undeclared offshore wealth and blatant tax evasion. The subject line was cold and clinical, engineered to trip their high-priority sorting, massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and illegal cryptocurrency leveraging at Hastings Industrial. I attached the dossier, named the exact home addresses of Nathan and Vanessa, outlined the fraud and the medical bribery, and signed off simply as a concerned corporate whistleblower. I rested the cursor over the send button. The winter wind battered the glass, but I felt only a profound calm. I pressed down, message delivered. The federal trap had slammed shut on their necks while they slept. I thanked Frank for his unwavering loyalty, shook his hand, and drove back through the emptying streets to the estate they had stolen from me. It was 6 a.m. when I pulled into my own driveway. The great stone house stood dark and silent. Nathan and Vanessa were upstairs, sleeping the deep sleep of the greedy, certain that in 3 hours a medical crew would drag me from my bed. I let myself in with a key that was still, for a few more hours, mine, and moved through the dark hallways without a trace of nostalgia. This was no longer my home. It was a crime scene waiting for the federal authorities. I climbed the back stairs to my bedroom and pulled a faded canvas duffel from the closet. I packed a few changes of durable clothes, my winter boots, my essential documents, my shaving kit. I left behind the tailored suits and the gold watches. They belonged to an executive who no longer existed. I carried the bag down to the pristine kitchen. The marble island was wiped clean, the perfect canvas for the last his message would ever leave in that house. I arranged the evidence with deliberate precision. In the center, the fraudulent medical file. Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease, staring up in bold print, a monument to their cruelty, with the corrupt psychiatrist's $50,000 invoice on top. Beside it, the forged property deed, the fake signature circled in ink. And on top of that, my old smartphone, wiped of personal data but with the audio application open, cued to the exact timestamp of their parking lot conversation. All Nathan had to do was press one button to hear his own voice boasting about stealing my empire and burying me alive. Then I took a red permanent marker from the utility drawer and a blank sheet of paper. My handwriting was sharp and steady, without a tremble. I wrote 2 lines, "Do not bother calling the ambulance," and beneath it, "And do not bother checking your bank accounts." I left the marker resting beside the note. When they finally came downstairs to await my extraction, they would not find a helpless, medicated old man. They would find the physical proof of their own doom. Their Cayman fund vaporized, their conspiracy exposed, and the full weight of the federal government already marching toward their door. I picked up my duffel bag and slung the strap over my shoulder. I did not look back at the grand kitchen or the marble foyer. I walked out the front door and pulled it shut. The latch clicked, sealing the tomb they had dug for themselves. The sky over Nashville was brightening to a pale blue as the sun breached the horizon. I climbed into the cold cab of my pickup, tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, and turned the key. The engine roared, strong and unburdened. I pulled away from the estate without a shred of regret, merged on the interstate, and let the long road stretch out clear before me. I rolled the window down a fraction, letting the biting wind wash over my face. I had been stripped of my wealth and my corporate title, but I had preserved the only things that ever truly mattered: my mind, my dignity, and my freedom. I drove south, leaving the freezing Tennessee winter behind me, bound for the bright coast of South Carolina, where the cold of betrayal could not reach. It was just past 8 in the morning, when the burner phone on the passenger seat began to shriek, the cheap, untraceable device I had bought with cash the night before, strictly for this moment. I picked it up and lifted it to my ear without a word. "Dad, what did you do?" Nathan screamed, his voice cracking with panic. I listened to the sound of his entire world collapsing. He was hyperventilating. The arrogant executive who had planned my medical imprisonment was gone, and in his place was a terrified child who had just realized he'd stepped into a trap. "The money's gone," he wailed. "I tried the Cayman transfer, and the holding account is locked. I checked my personal accounts, and the balance is 0. We have nothing. Dad, please, you have to fix this. The FBI is in the lobby. There are federal warrants. They're seizing the hard drives. You have to help me." I kept my eyes on the long gray highway ahead. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic energy. I spoke with the calm of a man who had reclaimed his soul from the darkest place it had ever been. "You told me to stop wasting your money, Nathan," I said. "So I did exactly that. I secured the funds, I exposed your conspiracy, and I handed your illegal ledgers to the federal government. I'm simply honoring your request to step aside. Enjoy your bankruptcy, son." I pressed the end button, severing the connection before he could offer another plea. I snapped the cheap phone in half, rolled down the window, and tossed the pieces onto the roadside gravel. The early Carolina sun crested the horizon, casting golden light across the windshield, warming my face, melting away the last traces of the cold nightmare I had escaped. I pressed my foot to the accelerator and drove into the open morning. I want to tell you why I chose to share this, because a story like mine is only worth telling if someone else can be spared the same wound. For most of my life, I believed that love and provision were the same thing. I thought that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed less enough, and left behind enough, my son would be safe, and he would be grateful, and that gratitude would look like respect. I was wrong about all of it. I had confused the size of the inheritance with the depth of the bond, and in doing so I taught my son to see my life's work not as a gift, but as something already owed to him, a debt I was simply too slow to pay. That is the quiet danger of loving a child so much, that you never let them feel the weight of anything. Nathan never split his knuckles on a cold rooftop. He never lay awake wondering if payroll would clear. I protected him from all of it, and in protecting him I robbed him of the one thing that might have made him a decent man. The understanding that nothing worth having comes without cost, and that the people who build things deserve to be honored, not consumed. But there is a second lesson, and it matters more than the money. When Nathan and Vanessa tried to declare me incompetent, what frightened me was not losing my wealth. It was the ease with which another human being can be erased, stripped of their voice, their choices, their very personhood, by people who have decided that a life is worth less than a bank balance. Elder abuse rarely looks like violence. It looks like paperwork. It looks like concern. It looks like a fruit basket and a soft voice saying, "We're just worried about you." If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Guard the dignity of the old people in your life, the way you would guard a child, because the world has quiet, legal ways of making them disappear. I did not do what I did out of hatred. I want you to understand that. I did it because a man has the right to remain the author of his own life, all the way to the end. I chose my freedom over my fortune. I chose my mind over my money. I'm driving south with the window down and the sun on my face, 70 years old and richer than I have ever been. I can tell you with absolute certainty that I chose correctly. Love your family deeply, but never let devotion blind you to greed. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a weapon you hand to your enemies. If the people you sacrificed for come to see that sacrifice as an entitlement rather than a gift, find the courage to walk away before they take everything, including you. A true legacy is not a mountain of cash left to ungrateful heirs. It is a life lived with your dignity intact and the courage to defend it. If this story opened your eyes, hit that like button to stand with a father who fought back. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another one of these hard truths. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And what would you have done in my place? Stay sharp, stay strong, and never let anyone convince you that your worth expired the day you handed them the keys. This is a work of fiction, written and narrated by a real person who cares about the people who watch these videos. The names, places, companies, and events are all invented for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to actual individuals or events is entirely coincidental. But the emotions underneath it, the grief, the betrayal, the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your own life, those are real, and they belong to more of us than we like to admit. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That means more than you know.